The rain came down in sheets over Incheon that Thursday evening, and everyone on the street had somewhere to be. Umbrellas tilted forward, collars pulled up, shoes slapping wet pavement in the universal language of people trying to get home. Sharon Odewunmi was one of them, bag over one shoulder, takeout container balanced in her other hand, already calculating the 14 minutes between her and her apartment and whether she could make it before the rain soaked through her coat entirely. She was not looking for trouble. She was not looking for anything. And then she stopped. It wasn't dramatic. No alarm sounded, no instinct screamed at her. She just stopped walking, the way you stop when something at the edge of your vision doesn't add up, and she looked across the street at the boy standing outside a noodle restaurant, trying to read the menu posted in the window. He was maybe 11. Small for his age, in a gray school uniform that was soaked through at the shoulders. He had one hand pressed flat against the glass and his head tilted at the angle of someone trying to focus hard enough to make words cooperate. And 6 meters behind him, standing under the awning of a closed electronics shop, were two men who were not reading menus, not checking their phones, not doing anything that people waiting in the rain ordinarily do. They were watching him. Not glancing. Not the casual half-attention of adults monitoring a child in a public space. Watching. The specific stillness of people who had found what they were looking for and were now deciding what to do about it. Sharon set her takeout down on the nearest ledge. She told herself she was probably wrong. She told herself it was nothing, that she was projecting, that two men standing under an awning in the rain was not a crime and not her business, and she should pick up her food and keep walking. She had been telling herself variations of that story for 26 years, and she knew exactly how convincing it sounded and exactly how much she believed it. She crossed the street. She did not run. She walked at the pace of someone who knew where she was going, which she didn't, and when she reached the boy she did the only natural thing available. She stepped up beside him at the menu window and looked at it, and then she turned and signed, without speaking, "Are you okay?" The boy's head snapped toward her. His eyes went wide, not frightened, but the particular shock of someone who has spent their life speaking a language that nobody around them understands, suddenly hearing it from a stranger on a wet street in the rain. He signed back, fast and a little sloppy with surprise, "You know sign language?" Sharon smiled. "My sister is deaf." "Are you hungry?" He looked at the menu again. Then back at her. Then, with the specific calculation of a child who has learned not to trust easily, "The restaurant owner doesn't know how to talk to me." "I'll come with you," Sharon signed. She did not look back at the two men under the awning. She didn't need to. She had clocked them, registered the van parked 20 meters up the road, the third man in the passenger seat, the engine running despite the fact that they were supposedly parked. She kept her face easy and her hand light on the door as she held it open for the boy, and when they stepped inside into the warm noise of the restaurant, she finally exhaled. Her name was Sharon Odewunmi, and she was 29 years old, and she had not planned any of this. She had grown up in Lagos as the first of 4 children, which meant she had grown up as a second parent before she was old enough to want to be one. Her father was a civil engineer and her mother taught secondary school mathematics, and between the two of them they had produced 4 children with 4 very different relationships to the concept of responsibility. Sharon's was total. She had been the child who double-checked that the gas was off before bed, who tracked her siblings' school assignments, who remembered every family appointment and managed every family conflict with the diplomatic patience of someone twice her age. By the time she was 12, her mother had stopped worrying about things when Sharon was in the room. This was both a compliment and a weight she had never put down. Moph was the youngest, born when Sharon was 8, and Moph had changed everything. Not because of her deafness, the family adapted to that within a year, Sharon leading the way, learning Nigerian Sign Language from a tutor, then teaching it back to her parents and siblings with the focused intensity she brought to everything. What Moph changed was simpler and larger than that. Moph was the first person in Sharon's life who needed her in a way that felt entirely uncomplicated. Not because she was helpless, and Moph was spectacularly not helpless, brilliant and stubborn and with a sense of humor that could flatten a room, but because the way they communicated required Sharon to be fully present. No distraction. No background processing. When Sharon was talking to Moph, she was only talking to Moph. It was the most peaceful she ever felt. She created a private sign system just for the two of them. Shorthand for inside jokes, for family gossip, for the things you say across a crowded table when you don't want your parents to hear. Moph called it their secret language. Sharon called it the best thing she had ever built. When the accounting firm offered her the Incheon placement 8 months ago, temporary assignment, significant salary bump, the kind of international experience that moved careers forward by years, it was Moph who told her to go. Sharon had been in the middle of explaining all the reasons she shouldn't when Moph put both hands up and signed, very clearly, "You have been looking after everyone here for 20 years. Go look after yourself for 8 months. We will survive." Sharon had cried at the airport. Moph had pretended not to notice and then signed "You're embarrassing me" from behind their mother's shoulder, which made Sharon laugh and cry at the same time, which was their most common emotional state around each other. Korea had been hard and good in equal measure. The language was not easy, but she was not bad at it, and by month 3 she could navigate the office and the market and the administrative machinery of daily life without assistance. The work was demanding and she was good at it. She built a routine. She found a gym, a church with a small English service on Sundays, a restaurant district 15 minutes from her apartment where she liked to walk on Thursday evenings when the week started to feel too heavy. Loneliness was still there. Not the dramatic kind. She was not miserable, was not counting the days. It was the quieter kind, the specific absence of people who already knew you, who didn't require explanation, who understood the joke before you finished making it. She called Moph every 2 days. She sent her parents voice notes. She was fine. She was also, as of 6 minutes ago, sitting across from a deaf Korean boy in a noodle restaurant in the rain, watching him devour a bowl of bibimbap with the focused efficiency of someone who hadn't eaten since morning, while outside the window a van sat running in the rain and 2 men stood where she'd left them, still not going anywhere. The boy's name was Min-jae Seo. He was 11 years old. He had been deaf since birth. He communicated in Korean Sign Language, which was not the same as what Sharon knew, but they had already discovered that the gap was bridgeable. Slowly, with patience, with the occasional drawn sketch on a napkin, they could make themselves understood. He had been followed, he told her, signing carefully, checking her face to see if she was keeping up. This was the 3rd time this week. Sharon kept her face neutral. "Does your father know?" Min-jae's expression shifted, something complicated moved through it, the way complicated things move through children when the answer to a question was more than they knew how to explain. "He doesn't believe me," he signed finally. "He thinks I imagined it." Sharon looked out the window. The van hadn't moved. The men hadn't moved. The engine was still running and the exhaust was still rising in the wet air, and nothing about any of it was imagination. "I believe you," she signed. Min-jae looked at her for a long moment after she signed those 3 words. Not with relief, with the careful assessment of a child who had learned that adults said things they didn't mean, that concern had an expiry date, that being believed was different from being helped. He was measuring her. Sharon held his gaze and let him measure. Then he turned his head slightly and looked out the window. The van was still there. He turned back to her and his hands moved quickly, with the slightly imprecise speed of someone signing under stress. There are 3 of them. The one in the van never gets out. The other 2 rotate. Different clothes but same shoes. My father says I watch too many movies. Sharon thought about that for a second. Same shoes was not a detail an 11-year-old invented. Same shoes was observation. She looked at Min-jae with new precision, the careful eyes, the contained posture, the way he sat with his back to the wall and his face to the door. He had positioned himself in this restaurant the way someone positioned himself when he was used to monitoring exits. This child had been frightened for longer than 3 days. He had just been frightened quietly, alone, with nobody listening. How long? She signed. How long have they been following you? He thought about it. Maybe 2 weeks. But different men before. These ones started 3 days ago. 2 weeks. Sharon set her chopsticks down. She thought about the accounting problem she had been working on when she left the office. She thought about her takeout sitting on a ledge in the rain, getting cold. She thought about Mof, the way Mof would look at her right now if she were here, that particular expression that said you already know what you're going to do, stop pretending you have a choice. She signed, okay. Here is what we're going to do. We're going to finish eating. Slowly. And then I'm going to call you a taxi and I'm going to walk out first and I want you to go directly to the door when it arrives. Don't stop. Don't look at them. Can you do that? Min-jae nodded. He was already calmer, not because the situation had changed, but because someone with a plan was in the room. Sharon understood that feeling intimately. She had provided it for other people her entire life and had rarely had it provided for her. They ate. Slowly, as she had said. Sharon kept her eyes on the window at intervals that she hoped looked casual. The 2 men had moved, one of them was now closer, standing at the corner, collar up against the rain. The van had pulled forward 15 meters. Repositioning. They were preparing for something. She paid the bill and texted for a taxi on her phone and smiled at Min-jae across the table and signed, ready? He nodded. She went to the door first. Opened it. Stepped out into the rain and looked left and right with what she hoped read as someone checking the weather and not someone cataloging the position of 3 men in the dark. The taxi was not here yet. 40 seconds, the app said. She turned back and signed through the glass, wait. 30 seconds. The man at the corner pushed off the wall. 20 seconds. The van door opened. 10 seconds. She signed sharply, now. Come now. Min-jae came through the door fast. He had been watching her face through the glass and her face had told him everything. She grabbed his hand and they moved toward the curb and the taxi swung in from the right, headlights cutting the rain, and she had the door open and Min-jae halfway inside when the man from the corner was simply there, beside her, close enough that she could smell the rain on his jacket, and he said something in Korean that she only partially caught but understood completely because his hand was on her arm and his grip was not the grip of a man making a request. She yanked Min-jae back toward her. He stumbled out of the taxi and she put herself between him and the man and said in Korean, loud enough for the taxi driver to hear, "Do not touch me." The taxi driver looked back, startled, and then looked at the man and made the specific calculation that people make when they are deciding whether to involve themselves, and chose not to, and drove away. The second man was behind them now. Sharon grabbed Min-jae's hand and ran. Not the way people ran when they were startled, she ran with direction, cutting left into the side street she had already identified as the longer route back to the main road, past the shuttered fish stalls and the stacked crates and the overhead lights that were on in some sections and dark in others. Min-jae ran with her without hesitation, without stumbling, keeping pace in a way that told her he had been prepared for this, had maybe been rehearsing this in his head for 2 weeks. They ran for 90 seconds and then she heard the van. It had gone around. Of course it had gone around. She pulled Min-jae left into a narrower alley and they pressed flat against a wall and she could hear her own breathing in his, and she thought with absolute clarity, this was planned. They had planned for exactly this. The two men on foot were the visible pressure, designed to force movement. The van was the actual mechanism. Whatever direction she ran, there was a net already positioned. She signed quickly to Min-jae, "Is there anyone you can call? Right now?" He shook his head, then stopped, then his hand went to his jacket pocket. He pulled out a slim device, not a phone, something smaller, flatter, like an oversized key fob. He looked at it and then looked at her and signed, "My father put this in my bag at the start of the school year. He said use it if I was ever in real danger." A pause. "He thought I would never need it." "Press it," Sharon signed. He pressed it. What happened next happened fast and out of order. She heard the van door before she saw the light from the alley entrance. She heard footsteps from 2 directions simultaneously, which meant they had a third man she hadn't accounted for, which meant her exit map was wrong. She pulled Min-jae further back and her heel caught something, a crate, a raised drain, she never established which, and she went down on one knee and was up in less than a second, but the second was enough. The man reached Min-jae first. Sharon launched herself at him with everything she had, which was not nothing. She had taken self-defense classes on and off since university. She was stronger than she looked, and she had the specific ferocity of a person defending someone who reminded her of her sister. She got between Min-jae and the man and she fought, genuinely fought, in the messy, graceless way of someone fighting for their life rather than a competition. She landed 2 good strikes. She was hit once, hard, across the side of her face, and the world tilted. She did not go down immediately. She stayed on her feet and stayed in front of Min-jae and signed behind her back with one hand, low, where only he could see it, "Do not move." The second man hit her from behind. She went down. The last thing she saw before the darkness was Min-jae's face, wide-eyed, his hands moving in rapid, desperate sign, reaching for her. The last thing she felt was the rain still falling. The last thing she thought was not fear, not regret, not the calculation of what she should have done differently. She thought about Mof. The way Mof laughed. The way her whole face became the laugh, nothing held back. Then nothing. She woke up in the dark with her wrists bound behind her and something cold and concrete beneath her cheek, and the first sound she registered, not sound, she corrected herself, she couldn't hear anything, was the particular vibration of a large enclosed space. A warehouse. The air tasted of metal and damp. She turned her head, slowly, against the protest of her skull. Min-jae was 2 feet away, zip-tied to a pipe, looking at her. His eyes were wet but his jaw was set. He had stopped crying before she woke up. When he saw her eyes open, he exhaled visibly and his hands moved, small and careful to avoid rattling the restraints. "I thought you were dead." Sharon blinked the blur away. Tested the zip ties. Tested the floor beneath her. Started counting exits from the count of 0. Then Min-jae signed something that rearranged everything she thought she understood about tonight. "They weren't supposed to find me," he signed. "Not yet." Sharon stared at him. Her head was throbbing in a way that made thinking feel like pushing through wet sand, but she pushed anyway, because Min-jae's hands had just said something that did not fit the shape of the story she had been telling herself since the alley. "Not yet." Not, "They were never supposed to find me." Not, "They shouldn't have found me." Not yet. Like there was a timeline. Like this had always been a possibility, just one that had arrived ahead of schedule. She signed carefully, keeping her movements small so the zip ties didn't cut deeper. "What do you mean, not yet?" Min-jae looked at his hands for a moment. Then at her. He was doing the thing children did when they were deciding how much of the adult truth they were allowed to carry into a conversation, measuring what she could handle against what he needed to say. "My father has enemies," he signed. "Business enemies. Not criminals. People with money and lawyers and other kinds of power. He has been in a dispute with one of them for almost a year." A pause, his fingers careful around the restraints. "I knew there was a risk. He told me there was a risk. But he said it was being managed. He said I was safe." Sharon processed that. "And the man who took us?" Kang Dae-wook, Min-jae signed, and even in sign language the name carried weight, the way names did when children had heard adults say them in lowered voices. "He works for the other side. My father controls access to a distribution network, warehouses, shipping routes, logistics across 6 ports. Kong wants the facility codes. The access points. If he has those, he has leverage over everything my father built." Sharon looked around the warehouse, really looked this time, past the immediate inventory of exits and threats and into the logic of the place. It was large. Industrial. Not abandoned, the equipment on the far wall was maintained, the lighting was deliberate rather than residual. This was a working space being used for a secondary purpose. Which meant Kong had resources and it meant he had time. A man with a backup plan did not panic. A man who did not panic was more dangerous than one who did. "They think you know the codes," Sharon signed. Min-jae shook his head. "They think I know where the secondary facility is. My father moved his most sensitive operations to a secondary location 8 months ago, after the first threats. Nobody knows where it is. Not even his full team." He met her eyes. "They think I know because I am his son. I don't. He kept me out of it specifically so that this couldn't happen. And yet here they were." Sharon closed her eyes for 3 seconds, which was all she allowed herself, and then opened them and looked at the door at the far end of the warehouse. Light came under it in the thin yellow line of a corridor or anteroom. Voices on the other side, 2, maybe 3, speaking in the fast-clipped Korean of people waiting rather than planning. That was useful. People who were waiting had not yet moved to the next phase. There was still time before the next phase. She tested the pipe Min-jae was tied to. It was solid. She looked at her own restraints, zip ties, wrists behind her back, ankles free at least. She began working her wrists slowly, methodically, the way her self-defense instructor had taught her, not trying to break the plastic but trying to shift the lock mechanism by rotating at the right angle. It would take time. She had some. The door opened before she had enough. Kang Dae-wook was not what she had expected, though she couldn't have said precisely what she had expected. He was mid-50s, compact, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had cured itself of the inconvenience through years of making hard decisions. He was dressed well, not ostentatiously, just the specific quiet quality of expensive clothes worn by people who didn't need to announce expense. He came in with one man behind him and he looked at Min-jae first, briefly, then at Sharon with an attention that was more thorough and less comfortable. He spoke in Korean. The man behind him translated into English, which told Sharon they had done their research on her, which was a different kind of frightening. Mr. Khan would like to explain the situation so there is no confusion. There's no confusion, Sharon said. Her voice came out steadier than her head felt. He wants something from the boy's father and he took the wrong route to get it. The translator relayed this. Khan listened, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite amusement and not quite respect, but was somewhere in the neighborhood of both. He spoke again. The translator said, the wrong route became available when alternative routes were closed. Mr. Kong is a practical man. He works with what presents itself. A pause. The boy activated a tracker. Mr. Kong is aware. Seo Junho will attempt a recovery. This is expected. What Mr. Kong requires is for the recovery to be complicated enough that a negotiation becomes preferable to a rescue. Your presence assists with that complication. Sharon looked at Min-jae. Min-jae was looking at Kong with an expression of such precise, focused hatred that she almost wanted to tell him to dial it back because Kong could see it. But then again, Min-jae had been carrying this fear for 2 weeks and the fear had somewhere to point itself now, and she understood that too. She looked back at Kong. I'm not part of this. I'm an accountant from Lagos. I met this child 3 hours ago. Using me as leverage is. The translator stopped translating. Kong spoke directly to her in careful, accented English, which meant the translation had been a performance of formality rather than necessity. You inserted yourself, he said. You made a choice. The choice has a cost. He studied her without malice, which was somehow worse than malice. Tell me where the secondary facility is and you both leave tonight. Clean. No complication. I don't know where it is. The boy does. He doesn't, Sharon said. His father kept him out of it. You took the wrong person and you know it, which means this has already not gone the way you planned. Khan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something in Korean to the man behind him and they left and the door closed and the thin yellow line reappeared beneath it and Sharon went back to working her wrists. Min-jae signed, he'll come back with more pressure. I know, Sharon signed. Keep talking to me. Tell me about your father. It was partly tactical, she needed Min-jae to stay calm and focused, and talking did that, and partly because she genuinely needed to understand what was coming toward them. Min-jae told her, hands moving steady now that he had something useful to do. His father's name was Seo Junho. He had built his logistics empire over 20 years starting from a single freight contract at Incheon port. He was not a criminal. He was not connected to any of the networks that Sharon had heard vague, second-hand stories about in the expat community. What he was, Min-jae said, was effective. Absolutely, relentlessly effective. He had a reputation not for violence but for consequence. When Seo Junho decided something would happen, it happened. When he decided something would stop, it stopped. People in the industry did not fear what he would do to them. They feared that they would never see it coming. Is he coming? Sharon signed. Yes, Min-jae signed, without hesitation. How long? Min-jae looked at the tracker fob in his hand. They had not taken it, which was either an oversight or a deliberate piece of theater on Kang's part. The light on it was solid green. The green means it connected, he signed. It connected 6 minutes before they brought us in here. He's had the location for at least 40 minutes. Sharon did the math. Then he's close. He's here, Min-jae signed. And then, before she could ask what he meant, the lights went out. Every light. All at once. The yellow line under the door, the security strip above the far exit, the standby glow of the equipment panels. Total darkness. Then, from somewhere outside the warehouse walls, a sound that Sharon felt in her sternum before she heard it with her ears. Then shouting. Then silence. Then the door came off its hinges. The darkness lasted 11 seconds. Sharon counted them, pressed flat against the pipe she had been working her wrists against, putting herself between Min-jae and whatever was coming through that door. She had one hand partially free, not enough to be useful as a weapon, but enough to feel the difference between bound and almost. She put the almost to use and kept counting. At 11 seconds, emergency lighting kicked in along the upper perimeter of the warehouse, low, red-tinted, the kind that outlined shapes without illuminating detail. It was enough. She could see the door, hanging at an angle from one remaining hinge, and the two men who had been on the other side of it were no longer standing. One was against the far wall. One was on the floor. Neither was moving in a way that suggested they had chosen to be where they were. The man who came through the opening first was not large in the way that threat usually announced itself. He was perhaps 45, lean, in a dark jacket with the collar up against the rain that was apparently still falling outside. He moved through the doorway with the particular efficiency of someone who had already mapped the room before entering it, and his eyes went immediately to Min-jae, and something crossed his face that was over in less than a second but was the most unguarded thing Sharon had seen all evening. Min-jae made a sound. Not a word, a sound. The kind that existed below language, the kind that meant I knew you would come and I was so afraid and please don't let me see that look on your face because it will make me cry all at once. He signed rapidly, both hands pulling at the restraints. Appa. Appa, she helped me. She stayed with me. Don't let them. Junho crossed the warehouse in 8 steps and crouched in front of his son and put both hands on his face and looked at him the way people looked at things they had imagined losing. He said something quiet in Korean, too low for Sharon to catch, and Min-jae's composure, which had held through the warehouse and the interrogation and the dark, came apart completely. He cried the way children cried when they finally felt safe enough to all at once, without preamble, with the full force of everything they'd been holding. Junho held the back of his son's head and let him. He did not rush it. He did not look around the room or check his phone or signal his team. He gave the moment every second it needed, and Sharon, watching from 2 feet away with her wrist still partially bound, thought that whatever she had expected from the man Min-jae had described, powerful, feared, relentless, she had not expected this. One of Junho's team appeared behind him with a blade and cut Min-jae's restraints. Then the man looked at Sharon, waiting. Junho turned. He looked at her the way he had looked at the warehouse when he entered, cataloging, assessing, taking in information in the rapid, organized way of someone whose thinking happened at speed. She was aware of how she appeared, rain-dried hair, a bruise developing along her left cheekbone, wrists marked from the zip ties, sitting on a concrete floor in the red emergency light. She looked like exactly what she was. She didn't try to look like anything else. He said something to his team member, who cut her restraints. Sharon brought her wrists in front of her and pressed them together and breathed through the returning circulation, which hurt in the specific way that returning sensation always hurt, not cleanly, but with full commitment. Junho crouched to her level. He did not offer his hand. He just looked at her, close enough now that she could see the specifics of his face, the tiredness in it, the controlled tension of a man who had been running on urgency for the past hour and had not yet let himself believe the urgency was over. He spoke in Korean. His team member translated. He asks why you stayed with his son. Sharon looked at Junho directly when she answered, not at the translator. Because he was scared and alone and nobody else was paying attention. She paused. And because he reminded me of my sister. Junho listened to the translation. His expression did not change in any large way, but something settled in it, like a calculation that had come back with the expected result. He stood and spoke again. He says, "Come. There is a car outside." She stood on legs that were less reliable than she would have liked, and she did not ask for help and nobody offered it, which she appreciated. Min-jae appeared at her side before they reached the door and put his hand in hers without signing anything, and she held it, and they walked out of the warehouse and into the rain. Kang Dae-wook, she learned later, had been found in the anteroom. The confrontation between him and Junho had lasted less than 4 minutes. She did not ask for the details and none were offered, but the specific way Junho's team moved around him afterward, not deference exactly, more the careful awareness of people sharing space with something that had just demonstrated its nature, told her enough. The hospital was a private facility 20 minutes from the warehouse, and the doctor who looked at her bruised cheekbone and tested her for concussion was professional and thorough and spoke to her in excellent English. No fracture. Soft tissue damage. Rest and monitoring. She sat on the examination bed in a curtained bay and stared at the wall and thought, for the first time since she had crossed the street toward a boy reading a menu in the rain, about what had actually just happened. Her hands were shaking. She noticed this with the detached interest of someone watching themselves from a slight distance, which was where she went when things were too large to be inside directly. She pressed them flat on her knees and breathed with the deliberateness of someone who had decided breathing was a task to be completed. Junho knocked on the curtain frame. He had a cup of something hot in each hand. He held one out to her and she took it, and it was tea, strong, and she wrapped both hands around it and let the warmth do what warmth did. He sat in the chair that was meant for visitors, and for a while neither of them said anything. Min-jae was in the next bay, being checked over, audibly fine. She could hear the speed of his signing to the nurse who had brought in a tablet to assist communication, could hear the nurse's patient responses. The sound of a child who had survived the night and was processing it by explaining it in detail to anyone who would listen. Junho spoke. He spoke in English this time, carefully, with the precision of someone who had the language but used it sparingly. My son told me. In the car. Everything. From the restaurant. He looked at the cup in his hands. He said you noticed the men before he told you about them. They weren't subtle. Most people don't look. He said it without judgment. As an observation. He said you had a plan. In the restaurant. Before the taxi. The plan didn't work. Plans rarely do. He looked at her directly. Not the cataloging look from the warehouse, something more even, more open. You stayed in front of him. When they hit you. He said you stayed in front of him. Sharon didn't answer that. There was nothing to add to it. I want to ask you something, he said. And I want you to know that the answer does not change what I owe you. The answer is only for my understanding. He paused. Why didn't you run? When you had the opening in the alley, before the second man, Min-jae says there was a moment. Why didn't you go? Sharon looked at the tea. She thought about how to explain something that hadn't felt like a decision at the time, that had simply been the next thing, the only available thing, the thing that the version of herself shaped by 29 years of being Sharon Odewunmi was always going to do in that alley in the rain. I have a sister, she said finally. She's 21. She's deaf. She's the most important person in my life and I am 11,000 kilometers away from her and I cannot protect her from here. She looked up. He was there. I could protect him. Junho was quiet for a long time. The tea cooled slightly in her hands. From the next bay came the sound of Min-jae, still talking, still safe. Tell me about your sister, Junho said. She told him about Moth the way she had never told anyone about Moth, not the summary version, not the version she produced when people asked politely and expected a short answer. She told him the full version, the one that had texture and weight to it, the one that started with a 8-year-old Sharon sitting on the floor of her parents' bedroom learning handshapes from a library book because she had decided that if her new sister was going to speak a language then Sharon was going to speak it too, no discussion, no deliberation, simply because Moth existed and that was sufficient reason for anything. She told him about the secret sign system. The inside jokes that lived only in their hands. The way Moth had stood at the airport 8 months ago and signed, with typical Moth efficiency, "Go, you're embarrassing both of us," while their mother wept openly into a handkerchief. She told him about the calls every 2 days, the voice notes to her parents, the specific loneliness of being competent and capable in a foreign country while the person who made you feel most like yourself was on another continent, unreachable by anything faster than a phone signal. Junho listened without interruption. This was not a common quality in powerful men. In Sharon's experience, they listened in the way that people listened when they were waiting for their turn to speak. Junho listened as if the information genuinely mattered, as if he were filing it somewhere careful, as if Moth's existence was a fact about the world that he intended to keep accurate and accessible. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "She pushed you to come here." "She always pushes me forward. It's her primary function as my sister." Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile, the architecture wasn't quite there yet. Sharon would learn later that it rarely arrived quickly, but something that occupied the same emotional territory. "Min-jae does the same," he said. "He tells me I work too much. He leaves notes on my desk with drawings of mountains and beaches." A pause. "I keep them." She looked at him. He was looking at the cup in his hands. She thought about a man who kept his 11-year-old son's drawings on his desk in what she imagined was a very serious office, and she thought about Min-jae in the warehouse with his jaw set and his eyes wet and his hands signing her name when he thought she was dead, and she thought about how children were the truest mirror of the people who raised them. "He's remarkable," she said. "Your son?" "Yes. Simple. Unhedged. The specific confidence of a parent who had decided that pride was not something to perform modestly. He told me, in the car, that he was not afraid in the warehouse. I told him it was all right to have been afraid. He said. Junho paused, and something in the pause told Sharon this was the part he had been carrying since the car. He said he wasn't afraid because you weren't afraid. He said he watched your face the whole time and your face told him someone was thinking, and that thinking meant there was still a plan, and plans meant there was still a way out. He looked at her. You were terrified. Completely, Sharon said. But your face. My face has been lying on behalf of other people since I was 12 years old. She said it without bitterness, because it wasn't a complaint. It was just a fact about herself, one of the central ones. It's a skill. Not always useful. Sometimes necessary. Junho nodded slowly. Then he said, with the deliberateness of someone making a decision out loud, I would like to know what I can do. For you. Not as payment. I understand that framing would insult what you did. As he searched for the word with the care of someone who understood that the right word mattered. Responsibility. You entered something that was mine. You paid a cost that was mine to pay. I would like to carry some of that. Sharon opened her mouth to say what she always said, which was that she was fine and she didn't need anything and thank you very much. She closed it. She thought about Mof. She thought about a phone call she had had 3 months ago with her parents, her mother's voice careful and measured in the way it got when she was delivering information she didn't want to deliver, telling Sharon about the specialist in Lagos who had mentioned, almost in passing, that Mof's specific condition was the type that sometimes responded to a relatively new surgical intervention. Expensive. Uncertain. The kind of possibility that was worse than no possibility because it required you to hope, and hope had a cost. She said, there might be something. But I need to tell you about my sister first. She told him about the procedure. He listened in the same way he had listened to everything, completely, without performance. When she finished, he asked 3 questions: the name of the condition, the name of the procedure, the name of the specialist who had mentioned it. She answered all 3. He took out his phone and typed something and put it away. I know a neurologist, he said. In Seattle. Riverside Neurological Institute. He has been working with this intervention for 4 years. His success rates are higher than the published averages. He paused. Min-jae sees him. Has seen him, for the past 2 years, for a related condition. Another pause, longer. He told me 6 months ago that Min-jae may be a candidate for the same procedure. Sharon stared at him. The tea had gone completely cold in her hands. I had not yet decided, Junho said, and for the first time she heard something in his voice that was not control, not quite, not entirely. A roughness beneath the surface, the sound of a man who had been holding a decision at arm's length because decisions of that size required more courage than logistics provided. The uncertainty. The risk. He is my only, he stopped. Started again. I had not decided. And now? Sharon said quietly. He looked at her for a long moment. Now I think perhaps neither of us should make these decisions alone. The referral came through within 48 hours, because Junho was a man who, when he decided something would happen, made it happen. The neurologist in Seattle reviewed both files remotely and called Junho directly and spoke for 22 minutes, and Junho relayed the summary to Sharon in the careful, precise way he communicated all important things, both children were candidates. The procedure had evolved significantly in the past 18 months. The risks were real and not small. The potential outcomes ranged from partial improvement to something that the neurologist, a man apparently not given to overstatement, described as transformative. Sharon called home that night. Her mother answered on the second ring, which meant she had been sitting near the phone, which meant her mother's instincts were as reliable as they had always been. Sharon told her everything, not all at once, not in order, in the slightly broken sequence of someone delivering news that her own mind was still organizing. There was silence on the line. Then her mother called for her father. Then Sharon heard Mof's voice in the background asking what was happening. Then her mother told Mof. Then the phone was full of sound, her mother crying in the specific way she cried when things were too large for words, her father saying God is good twice in the way he said things that he meant completely, and Mof who had pushed Sharon onto a plane 8 months ago and told her to go look after herself, Mof making a sound that Sharon had never heard from her before and hoped she would hear again every day for the rest of her life. They flew to Seattle 6 weeks later. Junho, Minjae, Sharon, and Mof, who arrived from Lagos with their mother, wide-eyed and composed in immediately, within 20 minutes of meeting Minjae in the hospital waiting area, deepened a conversation conducted in a hybrid of KSL and NSL and an improvised bridge language that the two of them appeared to have invented spontaneously, because children who had been speaking in languages the world didn't share had a particular fluency in finding each other. Sharon watched them from across the waiting room and felt something she didn't have a name for immediately. It came to her later, it was the feeling of a thing that was supposed to happen, happening. The surgeries were scheduled 4 days apart. Minjae went first. The waiting room had large windows that looked out over a gray Seattle morning, and Junho sat in it the way he sat in most places, still, contained, giving nothing to the room that he wasn't prepared to give. But his hands, Sharon noticed, were pressed flat on his knees. The same gesture she had made in the hospital in Incheon, the night she had been learning how to breathe through something too large to hold. She sat down beside him and did not say anything, because there was nothing useful to say, and after a moment he turned his hand over on his knee and she put hers in it and they sat like that in the gray Seattle morning for 3 hours and 40 minutes until the surgeon came through the door. The recovery took 6 days. On the 7th day, the audiologist ran the assessment and adjusted the processor and stepped back, and Junho leaned down to his son's level and said, very quietly, one word. Minjae went completely still. His eyes moved to his father's face. His lips parted. His hands came up, not to sign, just up, the way hands moved when the body didn't know what to do with what it was feeling. He said, in a voice roughened by disuse and wonder and the specific bewilderment of hearing yourself for the first time, Appa. Junho did not make a sound. He simply gathered his son against him and held him with the total, unguarded completeness of a man who had stopped managing his own emotions because there was no longer any reason to. Sharon, standing by the window, turned away to give them the moment and found that she was crying, silently, with a hand pressed over her mouth. Mof's surgery was 3 days later. Sharon sat outside the theater for 4 hours and 20 minutes and Junho sat beside her and their positions from the Seattle waiting room were simply reversed, his hand available when she needed it, no commentary, no performance of comfort. Just presence. Sharon was learning that presence was his primary language, that he expressed in proximity what other people expressed in words, and that once she understood the grammar of it, it was one of the most fluent things she had ever encountered. The moment Mof heard her first sound was not what Sharon expected. She had imagined something symphonic, a voice, music, something with immediate meaning. What Moph heard first was a door closing in the corridor outside her room. A plain, unremarkable, institutional sound. The audiologist watched her face. Moph's head turned toward it. Slowly. The way a compass needle moved toward north, not a decision, an orientation, the body doing what it was built to do now that it finally had the information. Moph turned to Sharon and signed one word. Again. Sharon laughed. She laughed the way she cried, completely, without reserve, until her whole face was involved and she couldn't see properly. The audiologist looked confused. Sharon signed to Moph, she wants to hear the door again. And the audiologist knocked on the doorframe, gently, and Moph closed her eyes and turned her face toward it like someone standing in sunlight for the first time, and Sharon put her head in her hands and wept freely and did not try to manage any of it. The recovery was not a montage. This was something Sharon appreciated and struggled with simultaneously. The progress was real, but it was slow, non-linear, full of days where the sound was overwhelming rather than clarifying, where both children needed to rest and recalibrate and be angry at the difficulty of something that was supposed to be a gift. Min-jae had 3 weeks where he refused to wear the processor because the world was too loud and unpredictable and he wanted the quiet back. Moph had a week of headaches so severe she slept through most of it. These were not the stories Sharon had imagined. They were better, because they were true, and truth had a texture that imagination never quite replicated. What did not falter was Min-jae and Moph's friendship, which had established itself with the speed and solidity of things that were meant to be. They communicated in their hybrid language and in the slowly accumulating shared Korean and English that emerged from months of proximity, and they encouraged each other through the hard weeks with the specific effectiveness of people who understood exactly what the other one was carrying. 1 year later, Sharon was still in Korea. Her contract extension had been approved in the same week that Junho had asked her, in the careful, unrushed way he did everything, whether she had considered staying permanently. He had not framed it as a romantic question, because he was constitutionally unable to lead with anything as unstructured as romance. He had framed it as a logical one. She was here, her work was here, Moph had enrolled in a school program in Seoul, Min-jae needed her, and, delivered last, without drama, he had become accustomed to her presence and found its absence, in the periods when she traveled for work, disproportionately noticeable. Sharon had considered this proposal for approximately 4 seconds and then said yes, which was faster than she had ever made any major decision in her life, and she thought Moph would appreciate the irony enormously. The wedding was small by design and large by feeling. Incheon, on a Saturday in early autumn when the light came in low and golden over the port. Her parents flew in from Lagos. Moph stood beside her as her person, in a deep green dress, looking like everything Sharon had ever hoped for her. Min-jae stood beside his father in a suit that he had chosen himself and wore with the solemn pride of someone taking a role seriously. The ceremony blended 2 traditions with the imperfect, genuine creativity of people who were not interested in performance and very interested in meaning. Afterwards, when the guests had moved to the reception and the light had gone amber and the evening was becoming itself, Min-jae found Sharon standing by the window. He stood beside her and looked out at the harbor and was quiet for a moment in the way he had learned from his father, the comfortable, loaded quiet of a person with something to say who was choosing his timing. Then he looked at her. He signed and spoke simultaneously, which he did now with the particular beauty of someone who lived in 2 registers at once. "Can I call you Mom now?" Sharon turned to look at him. His face was entirely serious. Not uncertain, he was Junho's son. Uncertainty was not his primary mode, but open in the way faces were open when they had decided to be vulnerable because the person they were being vulnerable to had earned it. She thought about a rainy Thursday evening in Incheon. A boy at a restaurant window. A van with its engine running. The specific moment when she had picked up her takeout and walked past it in her head and then set it down and crossed the street instead. She thought about zip ties and warehouse concrete and emergency lighting and a small hand in hers in the dark. She thought about Seattle and gray mornings and a door closing and Mof's face turning toward the sound of it. She thought about everything that had grown from one moment of not being able to look away. "You can," she said. Her voice was steady for approximately 3 syllables and then it wasn't. "You absolutely can." Min-jae smiled, and it was Junho's smile, the rare one, the one that arrived slowly and meant everything. He signed, "Good. I've been practicing saying it." Across the room, Mof caught Sharon's eye and signed, with impeccable timing, "Finally." "He's been working up to that for 6 months." Sharon laughed. Junho appeared at her shoulder and looked between her and Min-jae and read the room with the accuracy of a man who had become fluent in the people he loved, and he put his hand at the small of her back and said nothing, which was exactly right. A photographer took a picture in that moment without asking. It was unposed and imperfect, and it was the picture they kept on the wall in the end, the one that replaced the absence of pictures in an apartment that had once felt like a controlled environment and now felt like the most lived-in place Sharon had ever been. A Nigerian woman. A Korean man. A boy who had been followed in the rain and was now, improbably, everything. A girl who had heard a door close in Seattle and turned toward the sound of the world. A family. Not born. Chosen. On a rainy Thursday evening when someone refused to look away. If this story stayed with you, you know what to do. Like this video and subscribe so you're here for the next one. And I want to hear from you in the comments. What was the moment that got you? Was it Min-jae in the warehouse? Was it Mof in the door? Or was it the question at the end that broke you? Tell me below. This community runs on your stories too.